So on the question you've asked me specifically about encounter and how might that be a meaningful construct for us to analyse urban situations and then translate it into practice, I think it's a hard ask that I'm presenting to you to say let's look at interactions between people in our analysis rather than relying entirely on the ways that the census causes us to think about difference in the city, because we have all those official statistics about people in the city that are available to us. They're the forms that the public data take. I remember one of my PhD teachers, in the last century used to always say about census data, what it does is it tells us where people sleep. It doesn't tell us what they actually do. So what I'm actually asking for, and I think what this shift to thinking like that about encounter and all those other things ask for, is a move to have us in our analysis look at the activity in the moment, look at what's going on the ground between people and try and come up with some concepts and ways of data collection that represent that, rather than just focusing on the data about where we sleep, which is how you might see the census, even though that's there over, repeatedly collected, and so we have to use it as well. So then as to the question of practice and how one would use this in practice, well, most of you are far more expert on this than I. You all are, in fact. But what I would say is that this simply gives us the message that we really need to support in every way we can opportunities for gathering within those broader social norms of interculturalism and multiculturalism that I said earlier about making sure that these forms of meeting aren't harmful, as some forms of encounter are, but it really is just a push in practice for the recognition of juxtaposing people of difference, juxtaposing however we can, encouraging the notions of interaction, that there can be, the famous Lisa Petey quote I think Kurt and I used in our book in 2008, which describes how in the city all you need is a street corner with a couple of chairs and a coffee shop up the road, and you'll facilitate opportunities for encounter, and they'll occur. So I think that's all this means, and it's a call for imagination in thinking about how that might occur, and for entering into a design commitment and a pricing commitment in what we provide that will allow for that. And of course public libraries are the best example one could possibly ever have of that.
I wanted to ask you, thinking back to this morning's topic as well, discussions as well, whether you thought tradition was a barrier to the building of bridges between diverse groups.
It's an interesting question, and we'll sort of have a two-part go at this probably. Look, we were saying earlier, I think the notion of tradition is a really interesting one, and it's not really part of my own discussion as a urbanist at all, I guess, or it hasn't been. And I think we were saying earlier, or I was saying to Nazara earlier, that it has a particular view of time as static, which I think really needs to be challenged. Well, indeed, he said that in his talk this morning as well. So I guess I would not see that as a barrier. I would see that as one of the things that we recognise will be present in whatever forms of encounter we foster in the city or that take place in the city. We know where ideas about tradition are likely to be held in certain ways in our cities. So if we were a planner or a landscape architect or an artist or something, we would know when this issue was going to come up and what form it was likely to take. But I don't see it as a barrier. I see it as something to be perhaps part of a mix, and something which possibly would be part of those agonistic engagements that many theorists of encounter say is always part of what you might expect. Yeah, so I don't see it as a barrier. I'm actually not sure it exists really, tradition, but anyway, that's a...
5 minutes. They keep doing that these days.
I fully and I think Planning for the Company of Strangers is a wonderful
It was a better title, wasn't it? It really was.
I recognize that sometimes editors don't like that because what does it really tell us? But in reality, it is the thing that captures exactly what you dealt with. So I have two specific questions, and they may or may not necessarily address the issue that was raised about tradition. The first has to do with the fact that the concern for diversity, as I think you absolutely alluded to, often masks degrees of racism, and that in a sense, even the concerns that one sees in one's own university. You know, we established a position called the Vice Chancellor for Diversity 2 years ago, and we're all still baffled that what does a Vice Chancellor for Diversity actually do? And what he does is, for me, has nothing to do with diversity, but that's my problem. But the point here is that diversity, as seen by institutions, is often a fix that attempts to mask issues of social justice, and in a sense absolutely delinks it, as you said, rightfully so, from the history of colonialism and discrimination, so on and so forth. So my question to you, I wonder if in fact interculturalism, as you defined it, would not necessarily achieve exactly the same thing. Maybe it wouldn't, but maybe that has to do with my lack of understanding of how interculturalism can, in a sense, be pursued. My second question has to do with planning, that in a sense, again, planners very much grapple with many of these issues. And in the end, you made a very strong statement that had to do with how is it that our research needs to be a bit sort of repositioned to push beyond the normative stance of the profession of planning. But how can we do that if the entire profession is based on a normative idea in the first place? So I see here a contradiction between what we want to possibly achieve as social scientists or humanists versus what we can possibly achieve as professionals who are often tasked with very specific end goals by cities, by municipalities, or even sometimes by nations.
Yeah, and the last one is a really important point, and I guess as many of you would be far closer to this than I am, as I sit in my ivory tower now, about to retire in Melbourne. And I think the interaction between planning and the academy, which is the sort of form of practice I've been closest to in my own academic work, is a very interesting one and actually quite an open one, and that all we can do is to try and have conversations back and forth and hope that in the constrained professional environments in which we all work, there are ways to find the cracks. That wonderful Leonard Cohen notion of finding the cracks, that's where the light gets in, out of his anthem song, isn't it? That's the task. That is the task, to really keep our conversations going as new conceptualizations of things like working with diversity emerge, new critiques, have those conversations back and forth. There very often will be new conceptualizations that emerge from people working in practice that they can share with us in profession. So I don't have any, I certainly have no good answer to that, and I certainly recognise our professional environments are very constrained. And I guess I found it very interesting when I was, as a geographer, working as an urban planning professor, as a geographer sitting at that interface between critical urban geography and critical urban planning writing and studies. I found it really interesting that I mostly worked with community development people in local government. I mostly didn't work with planners, because it seemed to me that it was the community development people, like that guy, that wonderful quote from Dandenong, who were really struggling at the coalface with the social. And I don't understand why it is that planning has become, or I do understand, but it's become siloed from that kind of essentially social work. So I always call it social planning rather than urban planning. But I think interesting questions can be asked about why that's happened. So that's a long and not very satisfactory answer to that question. On the issue of masking and diversity masking racism, it's a really interesting argument coming out of critical management studies. In fact, a couple of years ago, if I'd come to your placemaking seminar, which I couldn't, I would have, and I've just written this paper up with colleagues, I would have argued that much placemaking masks place as well. That it's the certain diversities that are rendered invisible by some of these professional practices, certain versions of them. So certainly the thing about masking of racism is very interesting. I have a PhD student at the moment, I was telling someone at lunch, who's been embedded in the Melbourne office and then the Singapore office of a very big design and construction firm, which has diversity policies as, it's really proud of these wonderful diversity policies. And her PhD has been looking at what happens for diverse interactions in the events organised by the diversity policy people and what happens in the rest of the time in the workplace and what's the difference between them. So she'll be really seeking some idea of where the power relations in that office are being expressed in their distributed nature in those other interactions outside the diversity committee's interactions. So I think it's a matter of needing to call out when the masking of racism occurs by new fashionable policy statements.